This is the SGD 113 Worksheet 11 walkthrough video. In this video, we're going to do the lecture that would accompany the Worksheet 11 if this was taught in a class setting. So we're just going to start first working our way through the practice because this is a very short one. This is meant to be reviewed for the exam too. So there are only 2 practice questions. They are a little bit more involved, but that's okay. So this will be a great review for the exam too. I do have some stuff already completed, and I'll show that real quick. I'm not going to go through how to, start a Unity project. I do have a couple folders like the prefabs, scenes, and scripts. Inside the scripts folder, I did already create the first script called My Cube, and this is going to be for practice question 1, and I do have that open. I haven't made any changes to it yet, but if you don't have Unity open, you don't have a new project, a new script ready to go, I would pause the video at this point and set that up before we begin. So the first practice question, if we take a look at it, is to create a prefab in Unity called My Cube. Set up the code to make it destroy on a mouse click. So this is just a little bit of practice with creating prefabs and setting up some raycasting that uses mouse click events. So let's get some of the Unity stuff set up first. So I'm just going to create a quick ground plane. I guess it doesn't really matter. We can actually just create a cube that floats in 3D space. And when we click on it, it just destroys. It doesn't really need to sit on anything, I guess, just to kind of simplify some things. So since we do need to make this a prefab, let's kind of get this set up. The first thing is I do want to call this My Cube. And since we're going to be doing raycasting, and if you kind of remember the way that we've been setting this up, is we need to make sure that this has a tag on it so that when we click on the object, we can look at the tag. So we're going to create a new tag for this. So we're going to go to tag. Rather than untagged, we're going to add a tag. And the list is empty. We're going to click the plus, and we're going to create a tag called My Cube. We do want to make sure that we are keeping track of exactly how this is spelled so that when we go in to do our coding, we can easily set that up. So remember, when you create a new tag, it doesn't actually put it on the object. So let's select My Cube, go to tag, and actually tag it as My Cube. So as far as this goes, we should be pretty good to go with making this a prefab now, since we're not really putting a new material on it. We're not going to deal with any kind of physics, so we don't have to put like the rigid body on it. So I'm going to go back to my assets folder, and inside the prefabs folder, I'm just going to click and drag this in here to create a prefab. We know that this is a prefab because this turned blue, and if we delete this out, we still have it in the prefabs folder, and we can add as many prefabs as we want. So let's just add a couple. We're not spawning these on start like we normally do. We just want to have some in the scene so that when we go to game and we click on them, we can destroy them. Since we are doing raycasting from the camera, the other important thing we need to make sure that we check before we start coding is we need to select the camera in the scene, and we need to make sure that it is tagged as the main camera, and it is. Usually by default, if you work in like the created scene, this is already tagged as main camera. If you create a new project and go to File, New Scene, let me just save this one real quick. Every once in a while, that main camera will not be tagged as main camera. So it's always important to double check. It only takes a second to make sure that your main camera in your scene is actually tagged as main camera, or the raycasting will not function correctly. And that's one of the first things to look at. If your raycasting is not working, did your main camera get tagged as main camera? All right, so the other thing, I did forget one thing in that prefab. I do want to make sure that, wait, no, we don't need to, I guess we'll just make a new object in our scene to hold our script. So I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call this one just like game controller, because any script that we make in here, we're going to make another script for question 2. It's just going to go on this game controller object. So that was just a right click, create empty, and I renamed it. I'm then going to go to my scripts, and I'm going to just drop that game controller, that my cube script on the game controller, and we can see it on right there. As long as the game controller is in our scene and our script is on there, it will run when we hit start. We don't want to put it on the cube because since we have multiple instances of that, we don't want multiple instances of our raycasting running. So it's on that game controller. All right. As far as scripting goes, let's go to the script. And this should just be some review of setting up your raycasting. And what we want to have happen is we want to be checking, constantly to see if our user is clicking on their mouse button. And if you remember, and this is sometimes students kind of get a little bit ahead of themselves. They say, my raycasting isn't working. And that is because they forget to add their function to their update. So in update, I haven't made it yet. We haven't made this function yet, but I'm just going to go ahead and because I know what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it check for clicks. So I'm going to call a check for clicks function in update so that once a frame, it's going to be checking to see if the user is clicking on their mouse. So don't forget the step. Again, this is, if your raycasting isn't working, make sure that you put your raycasting function in your update. Okay, next, let's actually set up check for clicks. So I'm going to make it a private void check for clicks, and we do not need to send it any information. And we just need to put in our raycasting. And if you've typed this out before, definitely review what all the different pieces are, because I'm not going to put a bunch of notes in here. But if you've done it and you understand it, this should be a really easy script to alter. So what does check for clicks do? We want to raycast if we are clicking with our mouse, and we only want to raycast if we're clicking with our mouse. So we're going to do that with our if statement, and we're going to check to see if we're getting an input, and that input is our get mouse button up. We want to do get mouse button up because we don't want to accidentally be checking multiple times, because even the fastest clicker, if you remember how many times update runs, you can't click fast enough that you're not going to be firing check for clicks multiple times. So we don't want that to happen. So the mouse button up is a single event, and this will only run once. The 0 in here indicates that we're looking for the left mouse button to be released. So if they do the right mouse button or middle mouse button, it's not going to fire either. So if they are doing this, we need to do our raycasting now, and we're just going to set that up, and I'll kind of briefly explain a couple of these, but if you need to review raycasting, there is the separate raycasting video where I go a little bit more deeply into it. So first things first, let's create our raycast hit variable. I'm just going to call this one hit, and it's going to store whatever we click on. We need to create our ray to actually, this is the ray that will be raycasted, and we're going to say that ray should start at the main camera, so camera.main, and this is why that does have to be tagged as the main camera or this will not function. So camera.main.screenPointToRay, which means cast a ray from the camera to wherever that mouse cursor currently is on the screen. So input.mousePosition. So we got something to store our hit and our actual ray. So now we need to do our actual raycasting. So we're going to do another if. We're going to say if physics dot raycast, and this is actually casting that. So we're going to cast that ray. What are we going to cast it? We're going to cast this specific ray we just defined. We are going to store it in hit. So we need to write out hit. And we're going to go for 100 Unity units, because if we go 100 units and we don't hit anything, we probably didn't click on anything. So what this actually does is we're going to cast our ray, and we're only going to go in here if we end up colliding with something. That's why this is in an if statement. So what happens if we collide with something? We want to check to see what we clicked on, because if you remember from some other stuff that we worked on, you can set this up to check to see if you're clicking on different things. Are you clicking on a cube? Are you clicking on a ground plane? Etc., etc. So we only want to do something if we're clicking on our my cube. So we're going to say if hit.collider.tag is equal to, and this is where we put in what we tagged our my cube with. And if you remember, I tagged mine as my cube, and it does have to be spelled exactly the same. What happens if we click on my cube? We want to destroy that cube. So destroy hit.transform.gameObject. So if what we clicked on is tagged as my cube, destroy whatever we clicked on. And that should be it. So let's test this out. I'm going to save it, hop over to Unity, double check that it is on the game controller, my cube script. No errors, so let's try it. So we hit play, clicking in space, nothing. Click on the cube and it does destroy. And we know it actually is destroying because we can see it deleting onto the hierarchy. If you wanted to double check that, if you're running into problems or you want to double check that certain things are working, one of the easiest ways to do that is to do console print commands. Like, let's say that for some reason it wasn't working. First things, also, check to make sure that the camera is tagged, check to make sure that your object is tagged correctly and this matches. Check to make sure check for clicks is an update. If those are all set up and there's still some problems, we could kind of work through our check for clicks and see, where are we running into problems? Where can we get into our code before we run into an issue? So first things first, if I was running into a problem, I would probably come underneath this if in here and print to the console, mouse button up. So, check for clicks is running. If we do that, print, if we're getting that mouse button up, the first thing it's going to do before it gets into anything else is print mouse button up. So let's see how this works if we do that. Let me get rid of this real quick. Sorry about that. Let's go back to here. We hit play. And if we click, it doesn't matter what we click on, we're getting a mouse button up click event. So we can tell that that's functioning. Once we know that's good, we could comment that out. And we could go, put one in the next. So if that's functioning correctly, what if it's something in here? Let's actually see if we're casting, like if we run into a problem. Ray casted. And remember, this is only going to work if we're clicking on something. And we'll see. I'll show you what happens. So if we click into space, nothing happens. Because remember, we only go in that if statement if we have a ray hitting on something. So, it's going to, oh, that's weird. Why is that not printing? Did I mess up something? Oh, I have it commented out. Let's try that again. Sorry about that. Give it a second. So we click, nothing. We click on these and, they are deleting, but we are getting, I misspelled casted. That's okay. It's just for me anyway. We are getting that we did collide with something. So if we had something else in the scene, like a sphere, make sure I can see that, and we hit play, and we click on that, we're getting that ray casted. So we're clicking on something, but it's not tagged, so it's not going to destroy. So that's just an easy way you can use print stuff in your code if you're running into problems, or if you're just kind of working through stuff and you don't quite complete your code yet, but you want to check to see something's working. Print stuff to the console. And that's actually it for part 1. So part 2, we're going to do that in a different script where we're going to create 2 input fields in Unity that allow integers. When a button is clicked, check to make sure, that both numbers are positive and are less than or equal to 10. If they are valid numbers, print out a rectangle of these asterisks to a text object in Unity where the input fields are the length and the width of the rectangle. Practice using a value returning function to change the text object's text to the rectangle. Okay, so this is going to be a multi-step kind of problem. So I'm going to actually pause the video for a second so I can set up my scene, and it's going to pop back in with my UI already set and in place. So hold on a moment. All right, we should be back now, and what I've done is I did set up my UI, and I'll kind of show you what I did so that you can pause the video and if you want to set this up the same way. I just have 2 input fields called first input, second input, and a button. It's just called button because there's only one button, and this text field called print text. Since we do need to possibly do a 10 by 10, I did autofill this in just to make sure it's going to be the right size and that I can see that. But when we click start, I'm going to clear it out to nothing so that the user doesn't see this. So as far as a couple other settings, I did make sure that my input fields only take integer numbers. That kind of will help to make sure that we don't accidentally get like letters in there, so we don't really have to take that into account, so that we can just focus on checking to see what that input field is. So let's go to scene and let me click through these first. So there's first input, second input, the print text is this big, and I did have it font size 64, and I did make sure that everything fits in there, and just the button. I did also make a question 2 script and put that on my game controller, but I haven't done anything in it yet. So get up to the spot, pause the video if you need to, and then we'll go through setting this up. Okay, first things first, I do want to put in my public class level variables, since I'm going to need access to both input fields. I'm going to want access to my button as well, and I need access to that text. So we do need to make sure that we put our UI up here at the top. So we're going to add using Unity Engine .ui, and we'll just type all those UI elements in. So we'll do public input field, first input, public input field, second input, public text. We'll call that one, what did I call it? Let me just double check. I called it print text. And I'm going to bring in that button as a public game object. I'll call it my button. I just want to be able to turn it on and off so that we don't accidentally click on it when those input fields are empty. And that should just be review, but it's a good review. So first things first, before I do too much coding. I just want to kind of set up some start and update stuff. And then we're going to hop over to Unity real quick to make sure that we hook up all of our variables and our scripts hooked up correctly. And we're good to go with that. So at the start, I do want to make sure that my print text dot text is set equal to nothing. We're going to clear out that temp text we have in there. And I want to make sure that my button is set to set active is equal to false, because we don't want to be able to click on that until we have stuff in there. We can easily set that up too in our update. We're going to just check to see if our first input dot text, oops, sorry about that, is equal to nothing, or second input dot text is equal to nothing. If they're both equal to nothing, we want to make sure, or if any of those are equal to nothing, I guess that's why it's the or. My button dot set active, I always keep doing that, that set active is false, because if one of those has nothing in there, we don't want to be able to click that button. Else, so the only time it's going to be else is if both of those text input fields have something in their text box. We'll turn that button on. My button dot set active, sorry, is true. Let's go ahead and just write our button click function before we hop over to Unity. So then we can get that all set up. We can double check that these are working correctly. And then we can just focus on coming back and coding out the rest of it. So we'll do our public void on my button click. And we don't actually have to put anything in there yet. If you want to make sure that it's running, we could just do a print. Since this will be a good way to know that we did hook up our button correctly before we start coding some stuff. Okay, so just some basic stuff. We have our public class level variables. We have our start ready to go, and we have our update ready to go so that our button will only turn on when there's stuff in both input fields. We have our button click event put in place. It's not fully coded yet, but that's fine because we can just make sure that the Unity stuff is working correctly before we go and do some deeper coding. So let's go to Unity and let's get this set up. So first things first, let's go to wherever our script is. And I have my script on that game controller object. And notice I do have all of these input fields now. I'm sorry, variables that I need to put in now. So let's do the first input field. We'll do our second input field. We'll do our print text. And we only have one button in the scene, so that should be pretty easy. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a game object, so it can be anything in our scene. But it's just that button, so that should be pretty easy. The other thing we do want to make sure that we complete before we check is let's hook up our button click event. So I'm going to go to my button and do an on click, with that being on the game controller and our on my button click. So the only thing it's going to do is it's going to print to the console. That's fine. It should also only turn on once these have numbers in it, and this should be blank when we hit start. So let's hit play. And our button is actually disappeared. That's fine. And our, I think I did it a different way that we normally do it. I think we usually turn interactable equal to false, but this is a different way to do it. It might be an interesting way to work with stuff. So our text is also blank. We have those. So let's put in some numbers, 3 and 5, and then our button suddenly appears. Normally we click on it and the button is clicked. I know normally we do, I think, interactable is equal to true or interactable is equal to false. set active, true, and false will actually make that button disappear. So if you really don't want people to interact or even know that there's a button there to kind of force them to enter some numbers, you can do it that way. Also, if we delete one of these, that button should disappear, and it does. So cool, we are all good to go with this. Take a moment and make sure that everything is working. So if you need to pause the video. And the next thing we're going to work on is making sure that our user input is correct. Okay, so let's focus now on making sure that those buttons, the input is correct. And this will be good review on reading in input fields, working with that information, and also making sure that data is correct before we do stuff with it. So first things first, on my button click event, I'm going to comment this out. I don't necessarily want to delete it, just in case I run into errors and I want to kind of go back and reuse it. But I'm just going to work below that. So first things first, I do need to read in those input fields. So I'm going to make a new integer called first number and set that equal to what is in that input field. So we're going to first just type first input.text, and we're going to run into a problem since this is a string, and you can't implicitly put strings into integers. So we do need to make sure that we're converting this to an integer, and we do that with int.parse. Let's then do int second number, and we know we're going to have to parse that as an integer anyway, so might as well type that first. And we'll do second input.text. Since we did put the settings on in Unity to say that these only take integer numbers, this shouldn't be a problem as far as this shouldn't be a problem as far as like accidentally getting non-numbers in there. So we got our two numbers, and now we need to make sure that we are checking that they are valid numbers. And if you remember, if we go back to the directions, they need to be positive and are less than or equal to 10. And if they are valid numbers, print this. So we're actually going to go through and we're going to make sure that if there is something wrong with a number, we tell the user that there's something wrong with the number. So I'm actually going to make, let's practice doing a function with this. So we're going to make a new function called, and we'll do it below here, private void, and we're going to call it validate number. Actually, let's be even more interesting with this. Let's actually have it return a bool, a private bool called validate number, and we're going to send it first number and second number. The reason we have to send it the numbers is since we created these variables in our on my button click function. If we try to use them in here, it's not going to work since they are scoped to this function. So we're just going to send them as parameters here. And I kind of changed my mind in the middle of this. We're just going to be super easy with this, and we're just going to say if the numbers are not valid, we're going to just give them an error message. And if they are valid, we're going to continue on and do our little asterisk rectangle. So remember, with value returning functions, we need to make sure that we're returning something right away if we want to get rid of that error. So I'm just going to make a new bool called toReturn and set that equal to true, and go down here and make a new one that just returns that or toReturn, just to get rid of that error. I don't like seeing it, and I don't want to cause other problems. So in here, all we have to do now is validate these numbers. Are they correct? And if they're correct, we'll return true. If they're not correct, we'll return false. So we need to make sure that they're both positive integers and that they are less than or equal to 10. You could do this with one big if statement with ands and ors if you're comfortable with that. If you want to kind of break them off into like two different if statements, that's fine too. And I'm actually going to do the easier one where I kind of just work our way through. But if you want to kind of do it on your own and challenge yourself to do it in one giant if statement, feel free. So we're just going to say if first number is less than 1. I know it says positive, but we're gonna pretend that 0 is not, since if we're trying to build a rectangle, we don't want a side 0. It's not going to really work very well. Or second number is less than 1. So if either of those are not positive numbers, we're going to make that to return equal to false. So that takes care of the first thing. We're going to make sure that both of them are 1 or larger. We then want to make sure that they are equal to 10 or less than 10. So we'll say if first number is greater than 10, because we don't want that to happen if it's greater than 10, or second number is greater than 10, because it's okay if they're equal to 10. But if either of them are bigger than 10, we need to change to return false. And that's it. We're going to have to do something in the On My button click with this, but we're just going to return true if the number is 1 or greater, but also 10 or less. And if it's either 0 or less or bigger than 10, any of the numbers, we're going to return false. So we're gonna use this in a really fun way, and it's just going to help illustrate how Bool returns can be super useful. So up here on the On My button click, we're going to say if validate number, and we're going to send it first number and second number. So if this returns true, we know we have good numbers, right? And we'll code that in a second. What if this returns false? So if this is false, we'll just give an error message. We'll say to that text object, what do we call that? Print text dot text. We'll say error. Numbers must be between or equal to 1 and 10. And that should take care of that. Let's check it first. It's always good to kind of check as we go. So we're going to save this, and we are going to hop over to Unity. We shouldn't have to set up anything because we already did that. That's also why it's also kind of nice to set our stuff up before, before we really get coding, so we can easily come over and check some stuff. So let's hit play. Nothing should happen if we give it good numbers. So 2 and 2, nothing, that's fine. If we say 0 and 2, error, number must be between or equal to 1 and 10. What if we do like 2 and 11? If we just do 2 and 2 again, we didn't clear it out, but we probably should have, just to make sure we do a button click, but okay. I would definitely go through and double check every single instance, but for the sake of this video, I'm not going to. We know that it's working. We're good to go. So let's see. Okay, so we got that. So now let's take care of what happens if we get good numbers. If we get good numbers, we want to print out our rectangle cube. And if you remember from, if you look at this, we want to practice using a value returning function to change the text object's text. So we did a value returning function for this with the bool. We're going to do one now that returns a string. And we're going to kind of type this in first, and then we're going to actually write the function. So we're going to say print text dot text is equal to, and we're going to call it print rectangle. And we're going to send it first number and second number again. Because remember, those are scoped to the on my button click. Print rectangle will not know what is in those if we don't send it. And once we get this coded, we're done. So it's kind of a nice to work this way because we're kind of setting up our skeleton and then we kind of fill it in as we go. So underneath here, I'm going to now define this. So we'll get rid of that error. It's going to be a private string because we're going to return a string called print rectangle. And we're going to have an int first number and an int second number. Oops. And now we finally get to the meat of it. We are going to use some for loops to create this. And I do want to set up my return string. So I'm going to say string to return. And we're going to use this in a really neat way to write this all out. So we're going to set that equal to nothing. And it's important to do this because for what we're going to do to set this up. And then we'll return to return. Okay, so we are going to use for loops for this, where we'll know how many rows and columns based on the first number and second number. So we're just going to do this with x and y. So we'll say for and x is equal to 1, x is less than or equal to first number, x plus plus. So that's going to be based on this one. So even if we have a row or a column, however you want to think of it, of 1, we'll still run one time. And we're going to go until we meet that number, and this will make sure that this way this is set up that we get the same as this. So if it's 1, we'll have 1 row. If it's 3, it'll end up with 3 rows. So that's this first part. We do need to nest it, so we need to put in the second number, and that's going to be set up the same way. For int y is equal to 1. Y is less than or equal to second number, y plus plus. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to concatenate this to return string. So we are going to process our rows, and I think it's actually columns and then rows the way this is going to work. So we start in the first column, and we're in that first row of that column. So we're going to say, we're in the first spot. So what we're going to do is we're going to say to return plus equals. Actually, let's spell it out. It might help you kind of see the concatenation a little bit better. To return is equal to return plus an asterisk. So we're going to go to the first column, first spot in the row. We're going to put in an asterisk. This is going to get raised by 1. It's going to go to the second spot, put on an asterisk, et cetera,